Hello, my name is Marian Petrov and I'm Grandmaster from Bulgaria. Today we're going to continue with our course in the opening theories and the ideas behind most of the openings. So now into today's chapter we're going to finish finally with the moves e4, e5. We have seen so rich is the chess that there are so many openings only after this move e4, e5. Imagine after every other move how many possibilities there are in chess. So today we are going to see the most popular opening after e4, e5, which is called Ruy Lopez or Spanish game. Depends where you live. So now, what is the idea of this move? Like we have seen in the previous chapters, the difference here is that we're putting the bishop on b5, not on c4. So now, this move is a little bit less active than the other one in terms of attacking the king, because we are not pointing to f7. And usually after bishop b5, the game is more positional, more long, more balanced. So this is a transition to already different ideas in chess. Not only gambits and sacrifices and fast attack, but here now we will see that there is a little bit more strategy in this opening. It's very, very complicated. So slowly we have to find out that in the openings there are much more ideas than only to attack the king. So now let's see what is the immediate threat. Do we actually want to take the knight and then take the pawn? In the past actually they thought that this is the case. So in the early days here after bishop b5, the usual reply was just pawn to d6, defending this pawn on e5 and making some space for the bishop to go to d7. So now you could say that white can take on c6, and when black take the bishop, they will have these double pawns, which is not so good in general, and also this pawn is a little bit alone. But actually the double pawns, they're a different issue, so it's not so simple that only if your opponent has double pawns, it doesn't make him already worse. So actually this is not the best move here to take the knight. And after d6 here, white have few different approaches on the game. They can just castle, of course. They can play immediately pawn to d4 on this move, or they can prepare it and play pawn to c3. The idea of this move c3 we have seen also in the Italian game and in the Evans gambit. With the move c3, you are preparing the move d4. So let's say if they play bishop d7, when you go d4, in case they take on d4, you take with this pawn. So that's why you have exchanged the c pawn here for the e pawn, and you have these two very nice pawns in the center. Unfortunately, black are not forced to take on d4. They can play knight f6 or bishop e7 or something like this. And you still have these two pawns in the center, but now this knight doesn't have a lot of good squares, because his usual square is taken by the pawn. So most of the time he has to go to d2, which is already a little bit drawback of this line with c3. Of course this line is totally good for white, but this is not the ideal thing. So with the move d4, this is other pawn structure now. Of course, black can still play bishop d7, or they can take on d4, and then you take with the knight. So now there is a difference. We have exchanged our d pawn for the e pawn, not the c pawn. So we have this c pawn instead of d. So now we cannot play obviously d4, and this pawn on c2, it can go to c4. Most of the times it's good to have pawn on c4 and pawn on e4, because then the opposite pawn cannot move so easy on d5. So this is different kind of pawn structure in Spanish. Okay, so here let's see a couple of games in these very old lines. This line was played by the first world champion Wilhelm Steinitz, and also from Manuel Lasker. At that time it was the most popular line, the move d6. So let's see what's going on. So now I'll show you one amazing game which was played in 1894 between Siegbert Tarrasch and Karl Schlechter, two of the greatest players of that time. And this game is great not because there are a lot of combinations and sacrifices, but because positionally it was played in the very high style from the white player Zigbertarash. So after d4, black decided not to give up the center and play bishop d7, so they keep the pawn on e5. Now knight c3 is the most natural move, and knight f6, followed by castle and bishop e7. So for the moment you see both parties have developed the pieces, and this is a very typical position for this line with early d6 and bishop d7. There have been 1,000 games in this position played. So now rook e1 is also a normal move, defending the pawn on e4, and now knight takes d4 was played. So black have decided to exchange a couple of pieces, because usually when you have less space, if you exchange some pieces, it makes your position a little bit more free and you have more space. So now after knight takes, bishop takes, queen takes, castle, we have now one very typical chess position in which there is a pawn on e4 against pawn on d6. So what we should do in this position? If you play with white, you have to keep your advantage with the more space, not to exchange any more pieces. If you're playing with black, in general you have to try to exchange, maybe if you can, and the queens or the bishops or the knights, and then put the rooks in the center, and try to play maybe d5 if possible, but you have to be careful, because if you play d5 it will be always e5, so it must be very well timed out. So now the question is, first of all, where to put the bishop. You can play bishop g5, bishop f4, e3, but if you go bishop g5 and then take on f6, it will be good for black, as we already know, to exchange some pieces. So it's better to put actually this bishop on this diagonal and play b3 and then bishop b2, because now you are eventually targeting this square g7. So if this knight retreats at some square here, you can just play knight d5 attacking on g7, or you can immediately try knight d5. So now bishop f8 was played in order to defend on g7. So for the moment both sides don't make any mistakes, and they make very logical moves, even for nowadays. Yes, I mentioned already that this game was played a long time ago. So now rook d1, the most natural move, you see, and queen c6. Queen c6 is, black are trying to activate the queen a little bit to attack the pawn on e4, and also they want to play at some point maybe queen b6 and try to exchange the queens if they can. So now rook d3 was played. This is a very key move, by the way, rook d3, because here if you don't know what to do, you have a good position, but if you don't know how to improve, many people can play something like knight d5 in some moment, exchange the knights, or start to push the pawns, but rook d3 is improving the position of rook, and now this rook is heading to g3. So now when you put the rook to g3, and with the queen and the bishop here, knight d5 can become a real threat. Rook e6, they are taking the similar approach, and now rook e3, rook g3 now, black can play rook e8, and white were afraid that this pawn was going to be a little bit weak. So now they went for the move h3, okay, just to stop knight g4 ideas, and now queen b6. Like I told you, black wants to exchange the queens, and if you now exchange the queens, it will be perfectly fine for black, because the endgame is more or less safe for black. They have don't have any weakness, their rooks are active, the knight is attacking the pawn. Okay, only the bishop is a little bit passive for the moment, but this is not a big deal. But white have decided to keep the queens, and they're playing the move queen d3. So now pawn to c6, it's a useful move to stop knight d5, and now the knight goes to a4, attacking the queen, and after the queen retreats, white are playing move c4, this is something which I told you earlier, that this pawn from c2 can go to c4, and then for black it's not so simple to play d5. And this became very typical approach, this knight a4 idea, followed by c4 in this type of positions, because white have now disadvantage in the center, more active pawns. So black have to wait, so the maneuvering with the knight, king h1 is a waiting move, f6 now. Okay, this is a little bit strange move, f6, but black are afraid of this bishop on b2, so they decided to close the diagonal and put the pawn on f6, so now it's more difficult for white to attack on g7. Queen c2, another waiting move, knight e5, and now finally this knight comes back to c3, where it's belonging. This is the best square for the knight. Now knight f7. So this defensive idea to put the knight on f7 is also very common, because imagine that white start to push their pawns. It's more difficult for them to play g5. Okay, so still they play g4. Now queen a5. Rook d1 was played. So white are not in a hurry because black don't have too many useful moves. And now h4. So slowly they're building a pressure on the king side. The knight comes back to e5, and now finally rook is going to g3. So knight f7, again they're waiting, f3, again slowly defending the pawn, and now the knight is released from his duty, so he can go to e2, and then maybe to f4. Knight h8, again a little bit strange move, knight e2, queen c7, rook g1. So slowly now g5 becomes a real threat. So we see that only from one small mistake when black played f6 and then put their knight to f7, which looks okay defensively, but it gives white a chance to play g5 and open some files and diagonals. And now after knight d4 followed by g5, you see all the white pieces are attacking and all the black pieces. It's very funny that they are only in this corner, but they are not doing anything. The knight is terrible, the bishop is terrible, the rooks are attacking this pawn which is defended, the queen is not doing anything. And now this knight is ready to jump on f5, the rooks are attacking on g7, the bishop is also there, the queen can go to g2. So this is a very good attacking position for white. And after pawn takes, now again we should be careful how to take, because okay, it looks like taking with the pawn is very good for white, because the pawn is moving towards the center, but this will close the g file. So your rooks are not so active anymore, and black can play knight g6, and then knight f4, and then they will have some kind of counterplay. So here you have to take with the rook. Now knight f5 is a very big threat. Schlechter have played move g6, so he can play bishop g7, but now knight f5 is stopping this idea. And now the last chance for black, rook e5, sacrificing the exchange. And now if you take the rook on e5, then black can take also with the rook or with the pawn, and you have exchange up, but the game is far from over, because then it's more difficult for you to attack. Okay, because defending this pawn on g6 with the pawn and with the knight, and eventually if you can remove, if they can force you to remove this knight from f5, then they can play bishop e7. So slowly, if you have to retreat, it will give them some time to regroup, and the game will be prolonged. So that's why f4 here is the key move, very good move. So now they went rook f5, because if you take on e4, now suddenly this queen is coming to c3 with the bishop attacking the knight, and there is no defense here on h8. So black have decided to sacrifice on f5, but after pawn takes, they gave up because the position is totally lost. white can just take on g6 with the rook, and then this is one of the possible ways after hg, or they can play h5, and then this is just terrible position for black. And here we're going to use the help of our friend Paul Morphy. So another of his early games in 1858. So this time he took with the queen. So this is actually still not the real Lopez. Now it becomes the real Lopez opening. Initially it went from Philidor. And now bishop d7, and we have this similar position. But now our queen is attacked. So the point of taking of the queen is to exchange this knight. And now black can take with the pawn or with the bishop. Most people take with the bishop, not to double their pawns. But now bishop g5 is coming here, attacking the queen, and bishop e7 is not possible. This is the problem for black, because queen takes g7. Knight f6, white can just take on f6, and then you have to take with the pawn after queen exchange. So you're going to have very bad pawn structure. So this leaves you only with the chance to play pawn to f6. And now the knight from g8 has to go to other routes, not to f6. So after bishop h4, knight h6, with the idea knight f7. Also possible is to go knight e7 with the idea knight g6, maybe it's a little bit better. Then this knight h6, knight c3. So now again white is just following the most basic rules in chess. Develop your pieces on active positions quickly, then castle, and if your opponent's king is in the center, try to attack him. Bishop e7. And now here white can play queen c4, but then black will play knight f7, and still they can castle. That's why Morphy decided to castle himself, allowing this castle, and now he gave this check. Of course knight f7 can just be transposition, but there is no use of pinning the knight, so black have decided to play the king. And now here, again very typical position. So we have this position in which you have again pawn on e4 against pawn on d6. This time we cannot play the pawn to c4, and our bishop is 2, but on h4 this is maybe not the best square for the bishop. But what can we do to activate our forces? And here we can see that this pawn on f6 and d6 are making this square e6 very weak. So if we can try to move our knight on e6, it will be very strong, because it will attack the queen and the rook. That's why knight d4 was played by Morphy, also attacking the bishop. And now if you retreat back with the bishop on d7, white can play knight d5, attacking. Okay, let's just see this knight d5. And now in case of pawn to c6, for example, white can try even this move, knight f4. And now one of the knights will jump on e6. That's why black has played queen d7. And now knight e6 is a possible move, but Morphy decided to first to develop his rooks in the center. He was not in a hurry, because actually black cannot prevent it. So maybe he is waiting for them to play a move like rook d8, and then to play knight e6. But they have decided to play rook f7 to defend in advance of this knight e6 move. And now he could have developed also the other rook to e1, but he decided that it's time to push one of the pawns. In general, Morphy was not the player who was pushing the pawns like g4 and h4. He was always pushing his central pawns most of the time, because he realized that controlling the center is very essential. So also there is no point to play a4 and b4 and something like this. That's why f4. So this is also a very typical move. When you have pawn on e4, always it's a good idea to play f4, because then these two pawns are controlling these squares in the center, d5, e5, a5, g5. So for black it's very difficult now to do something active in this front. a5 was played, and now f5. So this move you have to be careful most of the time with him, but now this is a very good move. Why do I say that? Because when you play f5, imagine that this knight can jump to e5 somehow, if this rook was not here, black could have played knight f7, knight e5. So with this move, you are giving this square e5 to the black, but you are gaining control over the square e6, and you have to evaluate which is more important, to have control over this square or give away this square. And in this position, since black cannot put very easy knight or something else on e5, it's much more important for Morphy to control this square e6 when his knight can come in just in one move. That's why f5 is a good move. So now, black have to go back with the rook, so because they want to bring their knight to f7, and now finally we're playing knight e6, rook g8 defending on g7, and now there are many moves here possible, but Morphy was not in a hurry again, and he decided to play for the move a4. So a4 first is stopping the move b5, because black wanted maybe to play b5 and then b4 and try to exchange this knight on d5. So with the move a4 you're controlling this square b5, and you are ready to meet knight f7. Let's say if they play here, you can play something like knight takes, okay, maybe knight c5 attacking the queen and attacking the knight, or play somewhere the knight. So black took the other route via g4, which is safer, queen e2, now knight e5. So black managed to arrive with their knight on e5, and it looks like now the game is very, okay, maybe a little bit better for white, but black don't have any weaknesses, so they're having a good position, more or less, a little bit passive. The only problem is this bishop on e7. If this bishop was somehow exchanged for this one, then it should be okay for black. Now bishop g3, and now this is a very strong knight, so Morphy wanted to exchange this knight. Queen c8, bishop takes, and now pawn takes from d6. Both moves are possible, with this pawn also, but now with the d pawn, this bishop can go to eventually to b4 or d6, or try to be a little bit more active. So now, what to do in this position? We have two strong knights, knight e6, and the other knight can jump on d5, and we have to improve the rooks. This rook is controlling the d file, the queen can go to h5, and now here we want to attack these two pawns, g7 and h7. So like I said, the queen can very easily come there, so we have to bring the rook. And Morphy is playing rook f3, with the idea to go to h3, and black have to play bishop d7. So now I think Morphy was calculating here, I just think, I cannot say for sure, that maybe this sacrifice is also interesting. If you want to keep your knight on e6, and you're sure that rook h3 and queen h5 is enough for win, you can think of this sacrifice, because this will keep the knight on e6. So he can take some squares, but then black have eventually this move h6 at some point. So you have to calculate very precisely. Do you have this idea, rook h3 with queen h5? But there was no need here for the sacrifice, because actually after rook h3 they cannot take the knight, because you don't need queen h5 to checkmate. You can just make another very typical combination, rook takes h7, and after king takes, queen h5 checkmate. That's why rook h3 is possible, and black saw this and they have played h6. Ways for white to finish the game, but they decided to do the most simple thing, queen d2. It's actually hitting the bishop, and with the idea rook h6. So if you take the knight again, I want to take with the rook to h6, not with the queen, and again in the end it will be a checkmate. So that's why black have to leave the bishop and play with the king to h7. So we are winning the bishop. Bishop d6 was played, but this gave a chance for Morphy to make another combination. Of course, everything is winning here, just to change the queen, so queen f7 and queen g6. But he saw a very nice combination, and of course he was obliged to see the most beautiful checkmate, which is rook takes, and after king takes. Now, if you play queen f7, black can play queen e8. So they will defend against this checkmate. That's why you have to play rook d3. And now there is no defense against rook h3 checkmate. The only defense is to go forward to the king, but now already queen f7 is coming. And on the next move, queen g6, it will be checkmate, so black have resigned. So this is another example, this time from Paul Morphy, not only for his tactical skills, but for his positional skills, because until we reached this final position, the game was played very well positionally, with all these ideas, knight d4, f4, f5. So this is a very good example. And after a while, people decided that maybe instead of d6, they can try different moves. Because actually, they were wondering, is it a direct threat on the pawn? For example, the move g6 was played. And now if you take the knight, then black take with this pawn. And now if you try to take this pawn, now black have two ways to take the pawn back. They can play queen g5, attacking the knight and the pawn, but this is stronger, because now the knight has to retreat, and after queen takes, black have perfectly fine position, because you have to exchange the queens, and black have a good position. So after g6, you cannot win the pawn. So g6 was one of the lines possible, and if you don't take the pawn, you can play many lines. Again, you have the same ideas, d4, or c3 followed by d4. In general, these are the two main ideas in Ruy Lopez, because eventually you have to play the pawn to d4 sooner or later, and you can do it quickly, or you can prepare it slowly with c3, d4, or even d3, knight d2. So in case of g6, for example, you can play the line c3, and then bishop g7, d4 is possible line. And now, yes, black have many options. They can take on d4, they can play knight e7. Also here, by the way, after c3, black can play first d6, and then d4, bishop d7. So now after castle, bishop g7, they want to put the knight on f6 or e7 in castle, and this is a little bit different type of Ruy Lopez opening. And then finally people decided to play the move a6, which looks a little bit strange, because white playing the bishop with intention to take the knight, and you are inviting them to take the knight. So in the beginning, most of the people were taking the knight on c6, and now black can take with these both pawns. But here, this is a little bit better to take with the d pawn, because it will open the bishop. And again, knight e5 is met by queen d4, so this is not such a good move. And most of the time here, white can just castle, or play knight c3 or something else, attacking this pawn. And now there are many ways to defend the pawn, but f6 was maybe the most popular move, and still is. In general, as you know, this is not a good move, f6, but now this bishop is missing, which could go to c4. So that's why black can allow themselves to play f6, because there is no danger on this diagonal. And also this bishop can go to c5, not to d6. d6 will be a little bit passive. And now the idea is this bishop to go to e6, and then the knight is going to e7, to g6. So now black have many ideas, white also have many ideas. Usually they go for d4, and now black takes. And now they can take with the queen or with the knight. And there is one line, for example, if you take with the knight, black can play c5. And this is one of the very famous endgames. In latest years, there were many famous games of world champions in this line. So usually here, what can we say about this? Is very typical position. Let's say castle, and now bishop e3. So the idea of this endgame is that white have here 4 pawns against 3, and black have these double pawns here, 4 against 3. So if you can exchange everything with white, you can hope that the pawn endgame will be winning for you, because these 3 pawns will hold this 4, and this pawn will be like an extra pawn in the pawn endgame, but this is not so simple to exchange all the pieces, but many people are trying and playing this endgame. In general, the position is around equal, but it was feeling that white don't risk anything, because black can hardly win, and they can try to exchange pieces and go into endgame, so there will have been 1,000 games in this kind of positions. Later, it was also a very interesting line. In this position, black can play bishop g4 immediately, and it looks like after h3 they have to take on f3, but then after queen takes, this will be a mistake for black, because this bishop is actually a good one, and if you exchange for the knight, then the white have advantage already, because you don't have 2 bishops, you only have double pawns. But instead of taking, black had found the move here h5, which is very strange looking move, with the simple idea: if you take the bishop, and now if you retreat the knight, if you go knight h2 or knight e5, let's say, then suddenly after queen h4, white will be checkmated, because there is this threat, and if you play, let's say, f3, I can just play g3, and there is no defense. So this is not so simple here to take the bishop. White can play some other moves like knight c3 or pawn to c3. Then the idea usually is that the queen goes to f6, and black wants to take and double the pawns. This is a little bit more sharp reply for black. Another possible deviation here in Ruy Lopez is knight f6. This has actually become very modern in the latest years nowadays. It was inspired by Vladimir Kramnik's match against Garry Kasparov when he won, and this is called Berlin defense. And most often here the thing continuing with this castle, knight takes e4, then d4, and now knight d6, attacking the bishop. So when you take the knight, pawn takes, and now if you take with the pawn, knight f5, and now this is maybe the most popular endgame nowadays. Here white are trying to use the advantage of these 4 pawns against 3, but most time black are defending successfully with this pair of bishops. And now the final and the most popular deviations is here after bishop b5. There is very interesting move for black, which is f5. This is called Gambit Janisch. And the idea, of course, is that immediately if you take on f5, black will play pawn to e4, and now you cannot go with the knight on these squares, also here. If you go knight g1, of course, this is very bad. Then knight f6 and d5, so you have to take most probably. And now black can just take with this pawn. Now you have already available this square, but now after bishop f5, black have 2 bishops, and they will play knight f6 and bishop d6, and they have good position. So this is not so simple for white to receive the advantage here. They have tried the moves bishop takes, and pawn to d3 was tried, knight c3, pawn to d4. This is a very sharp line when you play d4, and now let's say pawn takes, now knight takes. And there is one line in which, for example, after take, here black are playing c6 with the idea to play d5. So there was one gambit line with the knight c3, giving away the bishop in Morphy style, and after pawn takes, knight takes e4, with the idea bishop g5 in castle. So now the best for black was considered to be pawn to d5. And after pawn take, it's a very complicated position. White piece down, but they have 2 pawns, and this king is in the center. So this line can be very sharp. If you want to play something more boring, you can play d3, just defending the pawn, and then knight c3, castle, and again very complicated position. And now let's go to the main lines. So like I said, they have tried the move a6, and in the beginning the bishop c6 was the most popular line, but then people realized that it's not so simple actually to win this endgame, and rely on this and d4, and then 4 pawns against 3, so maybe it's better just to retreat instead of taking. So after bishop a4, now again there are many moves for black. They can still go back to this d6 and bishop d7 lines, and bishop e7, but knight f6 is a little bit more active. Knight f6 attacking the pawn. And now you can defend the pawn with the move d3 or with the move knight c3, but if you defend with d3, then you don't have this option to play d4 anymore so quickly. That's why it's better to castle, because now, if they don't take the pawn, you want to defend it with the rook and keep this opportunity to play c3 and d4 in one move instead of playing d3. So now white are giving this pawn, and black can take this pawn. Actually, this is not losing. So if they take the pawn, what to do? Okay, now we can play rook e1 and then try to attack the knight, or we can play d4. d4 is actually the most popular line. Now the idea is that if they take on d4, then you go rook e1, and this is not so good for black because now the knight is hanging. So when you play d5, white can take with a knight on d4, and then they're attacking on c6, and also they want to play pawn to f3. So that's why here in this position after rook e1, after d4, first black have to play this move b5, and when the bishop retreats, now they found out that the best is not to take on d4, but just to play the move d5. Back the pawn, so white have to take the pawn on e5. Now this pawn is attacked, and black are playing the move bishop e6. And this was one of the most popular lines in the past for a while, maybe in the 70s, 80s. It was played, there were many games between Karpov and Korchnoi. Here white can try different ways, pawn to c3, knight d2, and the lines are very complicated here, so this is one of the main positions in this line. And later, here also, instead of taking on e4, black have decided that they can play now bishop e7 or b5 also. b5 is also a very interesting line, and now the idea is to play bishop c5, not bishop e7. And it's a little bit more active for black because their bishop is on c5. They will put the other bishop on b7. So in case white are playing the move like d3 to defend the pawn, black can just castle, and let's say they can play bishop b7 and then d6, knight d4, knight e5. But here white can play this line pawn to c3 with the idea to play d4 immediately, and it's a little bit more complicated for black. So that's why most of the time they prefer here to play bishop e7. Or on the previous move, it can transpose, attacking this pawn. So now usually white are defending with the rook, and black are playing castle. So now this is one of the main lines in Ruy Lopez, and like I told you here, the idea of white is to play c3 and d4. So that's why usually they play here the move c3. So now the d6 is the main line, with the idea to play bishop g4. In case of d4, black have to play bishop g4, but immediately not to exchange first on d4, because this will give the c3 square for the knight. So it's good that you keep the pawn on e5, and this pawn is still on c3. And now you put some pressure on the d4 pawn. So if they play d5, black will just play knight a5 attacking the bishop. And one very important thing in this opening Ruy Lopez, if you're playing with white, never exchange this bishop for this knight, because this is one of your most active pieces, so you have to retreat, and this knight is not so good here. So this is one of the lines. Now black have to play c6 and exchange this pawn, and the line goes after this very long. So that's why after a while they decided that white have to play the move h3, because they have to stop bishop g4, and now after this they want to prepare the move d4. So black now have very different plans. They can play knight a5, which is the main line, but they can go, even knight b8 is a move here, very popular, although it looks very strange to play knight c6 and then to go knight b8. The idea of knight b8 is to go with the knight to d7, but this is the most popular line. There are also lines with h6 and rook e8 and bishop f8. In general, the idea of knight e5 is not only to attack the bishop, because he will retreat, but now to push this pawn from c7 to c5, and now white can play pawn to d3 or pawn to d4. d4 is by far the most popular move. And now queen c7 is the main line, and from here there are many deviations. In general, white can push the pawn to d5. Now they can exchange on e5 on c5, but this knight usually goes, like in the Italian game, there is such a line when the pawn is on d3. By the way, it's a very similar line. This knight wants to go to f1 and g3. For instance, bishop b7, now you can play d5, and now there are many moves for black. Even sometimes they go back with the bishop, because, by the way, this knight from f5, this is one of the main problems in these lines for black. If you go with the knight b7, let's say here, again, very typical move is pawn to b4, because this is the only square for the knight where he can go. So that's why here usually this knight goes to c4 and then to b6. And now white are building a pressure. Knight g3, they can go knight h2, queen f3, knight g4 is a very typical plan. And they want to attack on this side, to put the knight somewhere here. And also g4 is in the agenda later on. So this is one very complicated line, the main lines. But here I wanted to show you another line after c3. Apart from d6, here there was the move d5, which was invented by the American player Frank Marshall. And I'm going to show you his game in which he demonstrates his weapon. And this was not against anyone, but against the Jose Raul Capablanca, the world champion and one of the geniuses in chess. So this is one of the most famous games in Ruy Lopez. And for this game, Frank Marshall said that actually he prepared this line a long time ago, but he was waiting for the chance to show it. And then it came this game against Capablanca, played in New York. So for the first time here, he launched his weapon with d5. Okay, what is the idea behind this move? This is a little bit more active than d6. And now it immediately attacks the pawn on e4. So white have to choose. They can play pawn to d3. But this is a little bit passive. Black can just take on e4 and then exchange the queens on d1. So more or less they have to take on d5 if they want to play for advantage. And now knight takes. After it was tried also the move e4. But in this game it was played much more popular, knight d5 line. So here now what to do? Capablanca was thinking he can take the pawn on e5. Of course, he was afraid a little bit from this preparation. Obviously, Marshall has prepared something. But in the end, he decided to take the pawn, because if you don't take the pawn, then black can just play bishop f6, followed by bishop f5, and they have a very good position. And now, white have a little bit difficulties to develop the knight and the bishop here. You need a lot of time to play d3, then move the knight and the bishop somehow. So you have to take on e5, and black have to take, and rook takes. So now, Marshall has played the move knight f6, and nowadays, actually, the main move is pawn to c6. Because black realized that they have to put the bishop on d6, because from d6 it will attack the pawn on h2 when the rook retreats, and they can move the queen to h4. So they have this idea, bishop d6, queen h4. And for instance, after d4, bishop here, rook goes to e1, queen h4 attacking the checkmate here, g3, queen h3, and then this bishop goes to g4, rook e8, and they have very good counterplay. So nowadays this is the main lines, but that time Marshall invented the line. He was playing knight f6, and his idea was to jump with this knight to g4, and then with the queen. So he thought that he has more pieces here, one bishop attacking on h2, the knight is coming, the queen is coming, so here he has very good compensation. Now Capablanca retreated with the rook immediately. He didn't wait for bishop d6, and now he decided that he has to play pawn to h3, because otherwise there's some typical combinations sometimes. Okay, in this position maybe they are not working immediately, but you have to calculate what's going on after bishop takes, followed by knight g4, and then queen h4. So it's very tricky. So he wanted to prevent this, and he played the move h3. Okay, obviously this was foreseen by Marshall, and here he played the move, I'm sure it was his home preparation, knight g4. Still, despite h3, he is giving the knight, and now this idea is to play bishop h2 check. And if you take the knight after queen h4, so now black wants to give this check queen h2, followed by queen h1 check, and then bishop takes g4 check. So it looks very dangerous for white. And if you play g3, now black can just take on g3 with the bishop. And if you take here, then queen takes, and now after king h1 it will be bishop b7 checkmate. So you have to go king f1, but then again bishop g4 is coming and bishop h3. So this is very dangerous for white, and Capablanca, after a while, he decided not to take this knight and played the move queen f3. So here the queen is coming to defend the king. So now in case of queen h4, which happened into the game, it was still actually part of the preparation, because, okay, now again take the knight, but they can also take the rook. But if you take the rook, this is also losing, because then queen f2 check, and then after you move the king, queen takes e1 is a checkmate. So this queen has to stay here. And now, okay, since this is also maybe not such a good idea, because if you take, then bishop takes g4, and then queen h2 is a checkmate in queen h1, because the bishop is controlling this square. So if you cannot take anything, the best you can do is to try to develop your pieces. So d4 was played at the center, and now the bishop can go to f4, and we can develop some pieces. So knight d2, knight f1. And after d4 here, it was maybe still part of the preparation of the Marshall, because he found this combination knight takes f2. And now after knight f2, black attacking the pawn back. And it looks very complicated for white again. They can take the rook, but if they take the rook, then they have to deal with this knight h3 check, and now the queen will take the rook. So this is not such a good idea. If they take the knight, then bishop g3 is coming. Sorry, not queen. Bishop g3. And white will lose the rook. Eventually, okay, they can play queen f3 to attack the rook, but now after taking, if you take the rook on a8, there are always some kind of checks with the queen here, and it looks very dangerous for white. So Capablanca decided to play some safe move, and he played rook e2, defending against knight h3 check, and also now attacking the knight. And here Marshall decided to continue with his attack, and he played bishop g4. Okay, bishop g4. Now white have to take the bishop, because if you take on f2, it will be bishop g3, and then when you retreat, black can take the rook here, and then they will play rook e8, and after rook e1, you have to sacrifice the queen. So you see how big preparation was made by Frank Marshall, and it was only in 1918. So at that time, people were not preparing usually so much for the opening so deeply. But Capablanca managed to do the bishop g4. He took with the pawn, the knight. So he gave this check first, and after king f1, bishop g3. So this line is a little bit more or less forced, because now the threat is queen h1 checkmate. So Capablanca have to see and calculate very precisely what he's doing. So now he's taking the knight, and he has extra already 2 pieces, because first he took the bishop, now he takes the knight. So now black can try, of course, to play rook e8, and then checkmate here from h1. But then it will be this check with the bishop, very unfortunate, and then white can just take on e8, and they have enough pieces for their queen, so after rook takes, it will be good for white. So that's why Marshall decided to play queen h1 check, and after king e2, he took the rook on f2. So now he was hoping that his queen is attacking, obviously, the bishop on c1. So if white take the bishop, he can take on c1, then play rook e8 check, and it looks that black have a very strong attack. But Capablanca managed to defend against this, and he played bishop d2, a very quiet move, just defending the bishop and taking under control the square e1. And now still he is attacking the bishop, so in case of check, white can just take with the king on f2, and now there is no queen e1 checkmate, there is only check from here, but white can defend against this very easy. So black have to retreat with the bishop. And now white have 2 pieces, knight and bishop, and black have 1 rook, and the pawns are equal, 6 against 6. But the white king is in the center, so it looks that this is more or less fine for black. But if white managed to somehow hide the king here and develop the knight and the rook, they're going to have advantage eventually. So queen h3 was played. This is a very unfortunate move for black, because now they have to exchange the queens, and this is the end actually of their attack if they exchange the queens. But still Marshall found the resources, and after queen f1 he continued the attack. But now the bishop have to retreat again on f2, and Capablanca again pinned the bishop. So with the queen f3 now the bishop cannot move, and here black have to find some way to improve. Unfortunately, this bishop also is very strong on b3, so they cannot include this rook into the attack, only with 1 rook. And here, so if they want to move the queen, they have to move it now, so they can move the bishop. Queen g1 was played, bishop d5. It's also a very good move, so this bishop is coming to defend here, so he can go to e4 and then to d3, so he will take some key squares, potentially. And okay, black have to try to do something, so they went for c5, pawn takes, bishop takes. So finally this bishop has found some freedom. But now b4, attacking the bishop and making some space for the king. And after bishop here, Capablanca found a way after a4 even to activate his initial position. So there is no need to develop the rook, just open the a file. And now of course the idea is just to take on b5 and then play rook a5 or rook a6. And we start to attack this pawn on b5, maybe after this to play knight a3. So this pawn is going to be weak. That's why Marshall decided to play a5 to complicate the things a little bit. And after pawn takes, pawn takes. So at least his pawn was not on b5, not so weak. Now white have many moves. They decided to go rook a6. But the problem for black is that now the white king is safe, because there are plenty of pieces around him. After pawn takes, finally even the knight is developed from b1. And now all the white pieces are very active, and the 2 pieces are stronger than this rook. So potentially also this pawn is very dangerous from b5, so this is close to winning. After bishop b4, just pawn to b6 was played. Bishop takes. Now the bishops are very strong, and they defend all the squares here, so there are no any checks with the rook. should stay here to defend, like I said. h6 was played, but after b7, rook e3. Here, Capablanca has found the most beautiful way to finish with the game with bishop f7, and Marshall resigned. This was a big shame because so much time and energy to prepare this line, and it was a big surprise for white. But still, you see the genius of Capablanca. Even in these circumstances, he managed to defend against all the threats and slowly outplay his opponent. But this is one of the classical games in chess, especially in Ruy Lopez. Nowadays, actually, it's considered that after this line c6, this is very good for black, and white have to be very careful with this pawn sacrifice. So that's why sometimes they don't take this pawn, but in order to prevent, in this position, to prevent these d5 ideas, usually white can play moves like, instead of c3, they can play move like a4, because then black have to play bishop b7 or rook b8, and then there are different lines. So they're avoiding this d5, or they can play also move h3. The idea is that, okay, you can still play this d5, but when I take the pawn after this on e5, this square c3 was taken, so white couldn't play knight c3. And now, white can always play knight c3 when they want, so it will be more easy for them to develop their pieces. This is the idea behind all this move h3, a4. Here was tried also move even, okay, in this position was tried instead of h3 or after h3. Sometimes they go a3. So they want to bring the bishop back to a2, not on c2. So this is also a possible idea in Ruy Lopez. There are many ideas. It's very rich opening. And now I will show you one of the most popular ways to make draw when top players are playing. Usually they go after this line. Okay, you can play, for example, bishop b7. Okay, h3, bishop b7, and now after d4, there is a line in which black are playing rook e8. So they want to put some pressure with this bishop and the knight on e4, and after bishop f8, they want to force white to exchange on e5, because otherwise after pawn takes and knight a5, they will be attacking this pawn. So sometimes they play this line knight g5, attacking here, rook f8, and then go back here, and then black go again here, and they can make this draw, but of course this is not the point to play chess, to make draw after 10 moves. So if you want to continue with black, you can play h6 to stop this knight g5 idea, and then if you want to play this idea again, you can do it later. Let's say after knight d2, you can go rook e8, followed by bishop f8. This is one of the ideas, like I said. So, okay, let's see another possible deviation. Here on this move, after 3 moves, instead of d6, f5 we have seen, also g6 is possible, and a6. Black can even try this move, knight e7. So the basic idea is, of course, if you take on c6, that black can take with a knight. That's why now this is not such a good idea, because at least before, when you were taken on c6, you were doubling the pawns. So now, also the other idea is that now black will take, and now they can play, okay, this knight is not very good on e7, basically, so he has to go to g6. So instead of f6, the knight is going to g6, which is a little bit more strange, but it makes some sense, because when the knight is on f6, often you have to deal with some e5 threats. On g6 is a little bit more defensive, so you are preparing against e5, and also eventually, sometimes later, this knight can go to e5. But then after, let's say, white make castle and knight c3 and develop everything, and they play pawn on f4. When you have pawn on f4, this knight is not so good on g6, because he cannot go anywhere. And now is there some threats f5 with a tempo f6. And also the other possible way to fight with this knight in general is with h4, h5 ideas. Okay, maybe not now in this lane. The other idea is if you play something like castle or c3, now black will play not only knight g6, but they can go to this g6 line, followed by bishop g7, and okay, let's say something like this, bishop g7, and d4. They can even take on d4, there is such a plan, and when you take, okay, you have this very good center, which is good for you, but now there are lines with d6, and then black try to play f5, or they can play after castle, let's say, knight c3, they can play the move like d5. And now the point is, of course, if you take with the pawn on d5, then you have this isolated pawn on d4, and if you play e5, the knight is already not on f6, but on e7. Black can play bishop g4, and then try to put the knight on f5 to attack this pawn, or play pawn to f6 to exchange this pawn, so the bishop can also attack this pawn, and this is another possible deal in Ruy Lopez, not maybe one of the most popular, but still possible. So you can see how many different possibilities are for both sides in the Ruy Lopez, and this is very rich opening with a lot of ideas and very complicated. And this is symbol-wise change a little bit in chess, that the people will start moving even after e4, e5 to play something more complicated, more strategy, not only sacrifices and gambits. So I hope you enjoyed this lesson, and see you next time.